We're looking at worksheet A17 on simplifying square roots, but I am going to jump down to number 5. Now, there's a reason I'm jumping down to number 5. I want to start with some little numbers just to sort of help bring our brains back into this. So, we have the square root of 12. Now, first things first, I can look at my sheet and see that the square root of 12 is not a perfect square. 12 is not a perfect square. So when I'm asking you guys what goes into 12, someone asked me, hey, what about 2 times 6? 2 is not a perfect square and 6 is not a perfect square. So the idea is 2 times 6 is 12. 1 times 12 is 12. 3 is a number that goes into 12. I don't care about any of those because I only want the perfect square of 4. So when I do this, I'm really rewriting 12 as 4 times 3. And please put that perfect square first. I think it helps us. Now you could skip this step, and I'm going to go right to the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. If you remember from our lesson, that was the rule. The square root of AB is equal to the square root of A over the square root of B. So if I can take 12 and break it into 2 numbers that multiply together, I can break them up. Now the reason I want the perfect square is because that's what I can take the square root of. So what is the square root of 4? Oh, that did not work. What is the square root of 4? What is the square root of 4, folks? It's not a trick question. 2. And if you want to double check yourself, type in the calculator or look at your times table. So this would be simply 2 keep the square root of 3. Your goal is to find the biggest perfect square. And I think some of you realize you weren't doing that in Delta Math because you had to keep breaking them down. All right, jump back up to number 2, please. So I've got, this is your final answer right here. 2 times the square root of 3. Now jump back up to 48, or to square root of 48. Give me numbers that go into 48. Well, if I'm looking at my times table, 4 goes into 48. Now, all I'm doing is I'm looking and saying what goes in. So 4 goes into 48 how many times? 12. Okay, I don't know if 4 is the biggest perfect square until I try more and exhaust it. So that's one thing I can do. Take 24 or 48, does it divide by 9 evenly? So you're going to take 48 in your calculator, and you're going to divide by 9. Does it work? No. All right, what's the next perfect square? So I'm going to take 48 and see if it divides evenly by 16. Okay, 16 times 3. That is the highest. If I needed to double check, I would just keep going through my list. 48 does not divide by 25 and definitely does not divide evenly by 36. Okay, 4 and 12 work because 4 is a perfect square, but 12 has to be broken down. So there's 2 ways to know that I've gotten the biggest perfect square. One, I go through my list until I get to half of 48 and then I know I'm done. Or I could start high on my list and start working down. The other thing I can do is I know that 4 was a perfect square, and if I look at the number 12, it has another perfect square in it. So if I can break this down, what was 4 times 4? 16. So there's a couple ways to play with numbers. So we decided that this was the biggest perfect square. So square root of 16 times the square root of 3. Okay, put your perfect square first, because what is the square root of 16? 4 times the square root of 3. Talk about 16. First thing I do before I try to break it down is I want to see if it's a perfect square. It is. Now, if I wasn't sure if it was a perfect square, I just type it in my calculator. The square root of 16 is 4. Now, we just talked about this. The square root of 16 is 4, and that's it. You took the square root sign is gone. If I was trying to see if the square root of 45 worked, I would type in square root of 45. If I don't get a whole number, then it's not a perfect square. So then I have to break my 45 down. So what I was doing yesterday and the day before was I was saying, hey, what's half of 45? Well, half of 45 is like what? 45 divided by 2, 22.5. So I'm just saying if I cut this in half, then I'm not looking at any perfect squares greater than that number. So does 45 divide by 16 evenly? I'm just going through my list. So 45 divided by 16 does not divide evenly. Next perfect square is 9. Now, if I know my times table, I already know that this works. 9 times 5 is 45. So put your perfect square first. Put your leftover factor there. Square root of 9 is 3. Keep the square root of 5. So I could say 3 square root of 5 or 3 times the square root of 5. It is multiplication. Okay, let's pick one more on the back. I was thinking about number 15, unless there's something else you would prefer. There's definitely like a couple perfect squares on this worksheet. All right, I'm looking at 15. 80 is not a perfect square. I know for 2 reasons. It's not on my list of perfect squares. If I take the square root of 80, I get really close to 9, but it's not a whole number. Okay, so start looking at it. I normally cut it in half. Guys, here's the deal. I don't have to try every perfect square. If I cut this in half, then I don't have to try any perfect squares above 40. So I'm going to start at 36. Does 80 divide by 36? So I'm taking 80 and I'm dividing by 36. It doesn't divide evenly. Okay. Now, sometimes it's obvious we know that. Sometimes we think it doesn't work and we skip it and it was the one that worked. What's my next perfect square after 36? 25. Yeah, and I know it doesn't divide by 25 because it doesn't end in the right number. So it divides, but not as a whole number. All right, 16. Yeah. Yes, how many times? 5 times. So here's another way I know that this is the biggest perfect square, 16. 5 doesn't break down and it doesn't have any perfect square roots. So I'm going to rewrite this as 16 times 5. Now you could skip that and go right to here. What is the square root of 16? 4. Keep the square root of 5. Okay, so go ahead and show. So you could skip the first step, but I want to see what you took the root of and what you got out. And a lot of us talked about this. It's much better if you put the perfect square first.